On Wednesday, as we've covered, MPs were prepared to vote on what was supposed to be an SNP motion on a ceasefire in Israel's war on Gaza. And as we know, that vote did not turn out as expected. But in the run up to that vote, various groups across Britain who have been campaigning for a ceasefire mobilised in order to lobby their MPs. And some of this lobbying was done via email, via letters, and some of it was done in person. It's called a protest. However, these protests have sparked an escalation in what appears to be, at least to me, a new strain of a perpetually rumbling Islamophobic moral panic. And here's Talk TV right-wing rent-a-gob Julia Hartley Brewer on pro-Palestine demonstrators.
A highly political, highly violent ideology called Islamism is sweeping our nation. No, this is not Islamophobia. This is real. You know how this is real? Because we actually see the victims of that, not just in Mike Freer, the Justice Minister, who said he's not standing for Parliament again because of the threats to him and his family from Islamist ideologists. We see it in Sir David Amess, an MP brutally murdered because of Islamist ideology. We see that in Stephen Timms, a Labour MP, thankfully survived a stabbing in his own constituency. Yes, we all focus on Jo Cox, talk about her all the time. Another tragic death at the hands of a far-right extremist. But actually, the far-right extremist violence is by far the minority.
Crazy way to say that, and it's simply not true. The biggest threat to the UK from extremism is the far right, as Britain's top counter-terrorism officers said in 2019. Now, while Julia Hartley Brewer is hardly the most reliable source of temperature checking, her extreme bigotry when it comes to pro-Palestine protesters is indicative of a sentiment that's cutting through to liberal circles too. Here's Hartley Brewer referencing events in Parliament on Wednesday.
No one should be surprised by what happened in the House of Commons last night. We have been brushing this issue under the carpet for years. Another terror attack, another killing of an MP. Oh, don't worry, let's light a candle, let's all sing, don't look back in anger and sing Kumbaya, and everything will be okay. The one thing we must not do is face up to the threat that we have imported to our country. And no, this isn't Islamophobia. This isn't talking about the 4 million Muslims who live peaceably in this country, who want to just make a life for themselves, for their children, go to work and live lives the same as everyone else of any other religion or none. We are talking, though, about a sizable minority, a far too large minority.
You can't just be Islamophobic and say this isn't Islamophobia, because it is Islamophobia. And this is part of a wider narrative which paints pro-Palestine protesters and supporters of that movement as two things. One, as particularly aggressive and abusive towards parliamentarians or anyone who might question, pro-Palestine support. And two, explicitly and exclusively Muslim. Common Speaker Lindsay Hoyle's excuse for his procedural bypass on the SNP ceasefire vote on Wednesday was that his fears for the safety of MPs were so great he just had to change the rules.
I never, ever want to go through a situation where I pick up a phone to find a friend of whatever side has been murdered by terrorists. I also don't want another attack on this house. I was in the chair on that day. I have seen, I have witnessed. I won't share the details, but the details of the things that have been brought to me are absolutely frightening on all members of this house. On all sides. I have a duty of care, and I say that. And if my mistake is looking after members, I am guilty. I am guilty because I have a duty of care that I will carry out to protect people. It is the protection that led me to make a wrong decision. But what I do not apologise is the risk that's being put on all members at the moment. I had serious meetings yesterday with the police on the issues and threats to politicians, threats heading to an election. And I do not want anything to happen again. So yes, I will apologise. I always will when I make a mistake. I did. I offer an SO24. That is within my gift and power. But I will also say I will do whatever it is to protect anybody in this chamber or anybody who works in this House.
Now, what Hoyle does there is paint Palestine protesters as a unique threat because he's changing procedure for the first time in 25 years. And those 25 years have included, a real escalation in digital abuse and threats against Black and Asian, particularly female MPs. It's included 2 deaths at the hands of extremists of MPs. But it's this moment that Hoyle is saying that the threat from pro-Palestine protesters is so great, we have to change parliamentary procedure. This is a unique threat. And it's not just Hoyle doing this. This was Labour MSP Paul Sweeney yesterday. The Glasgow constituency office of Labour MSPs was stormed by protesters this afternoon, terrifying and threatening our staff who are working to help Glasgow constituents. Thanks to @Police Scotland for ensuring their safety. The Speaker is right to try and calm this down. Sounds absolutely terrifying, right? Except this was the video published by The Scotsman, a paper in Scotland, of the storming of those Labour offices.
I'm John, I'm from Gaza Genocide Emergency Committee. We're outside the Labour Party offices here in Wilson Street in Glasgow, and we're here to request that Labour representatives make a substantive statement, not just on the ceasefire, which they've been prevaricating about, but they actually take a position on the genocide itself. We went into the offices very peacefully, obviously, and we requested to speak to some of the staff. No one was there, alas, and we're not sure where they are.
15 people turned up, at least that was according to a staff photographer who worked for The Scotsman, and no Labour staff were even there. Stormed, right, okay. The police disputed Sweeney's account, and here's what The National reported today. Police Scotland has now confirmed it was not aware of anyone storming in or threatening Labour staff. Police Scotland also said it was made aware of a, quote, peaceful protest that officers attended with no issues because the protesters involved left of their own accord. Back in London, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign also says they're going to lodge a complaint about their treatment because a large group of people gathered to lobby MPs in person in Westminster. They were mobilised, like you do when you're in a campaign. However, when demonstrators arrived, they were told a, quote, special procedure had been employed, which specified that pro-Palestine protesters were limited to only allow 50 people maximum in Parliament, because normally you can go in and you can lobby people in Westminster Hall, but that wasn't allowed. And the Palestine Solidarity Campaign says other groups have been allowed to bring in as many people as they want into Parliament. Labour MP John McDonnell backs up their complaint. He says this: I raised this in Parliament. This is no way to treat constituents simply coming to meet their MPs. Large lobbies take place frequently and are not treated like this. Now, the portrayal of peaceful pro-Palestine protests as volatile and angry has been in process for a while. Remember, hate marches was how former Home Secretary Suella Braverman and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak framed the peace marches on Remembrance Sunday 2023. And if we want to get into the stats, Open Democracy reported that Palestine peace marches from October to December 2023 actually had a total arrest rate lower than Glastonbury Festival. So that's 3 months versus 3 days. But never mind that. Just today, for example, Sir William Shawcross, who was appointed by Boris Johnson to review the controversial Prevent counter-terrorism strategy last year, was issuing coded warnings about, quote, Hamas sympathisers. So Shawcross had told BBC reporters that the Prevent strategy isn't focused on, quote, Islamist concerns. He said this: there are unfortunately quite a lot of Hamas sympathisers and some operatives in this country. Prevent and the police should have been working much harder against those Hamas people in this country. The public are more at risk because of the events of 7th of October and subsequently, and many people in this country are much more frightened than they have ever been before. Now, this is a guy who, when he was in charge of that review, only turned up to about 6 of the key meetings. And his comments were, you're not focusing enough on Islamists, you're focusing too much on the far right, which even the Home Office was like, don't know about that, mate. But never mind that the popular pro-Palestine movement is composed of a huge range of groups, nor that support for a ceasefire, and talking about just a ceasefire here, is a majority public opinion in Britain. Because now it's not just the right who are positioning pro-Palestine protesters as a threat to democracy rather than an expression of it. It's also the centrists. And that's why I want to know, Ash, do you think we are seeing a fresh expression of Islamophobic moral panic channeled by those MP safety concerns?
Yes. Do you want me to say yes but longer? Because I can also say yes
I'd love
but
a
longer.
yes but longer. I would love a yes but longer.
But definitely yes. And I think that there's two sides to this equation. One is, I think, the vein of anti-democratic ideology that runs through the political media class. And the other is, as you just mentioned, a particular kind of Islamic mistrust and demonization of British Muslim citizens. So to start with that anti-democratic vein, I think you see it very well when peaceful protesters who have not stormed into an MP's office. A door was held open for them and they entered and they held some placards. That being described in the most emotive and hyperbolic ways. Politicians can only talk like that because journalists themselves feel like they're under threat from the public as well. Now, I'm not talking about abuse, harassment, intimidation, threats, or violence. Of course, all of those things are completely wrong. And I say that as a journalist who has faced harassment, abuse, threats, and violence from people. Some of those behaviors I've even experienced from my fellow journalists. So I'm not trying to cast criminal, harmful behavior as somehow morally justified. I'm not. But I'm looking at how democratic participation, like peaceful protest, is looked upon by journalists and by politicians as nothing less than attempted murder. There was an edition of Playbook, to which, for my sins, I'm a subscriber, where the writer of that morning's Playbook had mentioned that they'd been in central London when they'd been out to buy Lego for their kid and said, oh, scary stuff. Well, what was scary about it? What was it that you saw that made you feel that you were at risk? The fact that you're not mentioning anything specific makes me feel that, yeah, you find it scary, but there's not actually anything going on. Otherwise, you would have written about it. You just find something inherently threatening about the idea of peaceful protest. Similarly, MPs who are, saying, oh, my office has been stormed, or I didn't want to go outside because people were chanting. That's kind of a you problem. I'm sorry. You have to be able to distinguish between threats, violence, harassment, and legitimate, lawful, peaceful, democratic participation. And just to give you an example of some coverage which I've just read from Sky News, which was trying to look at this climate of fear that MPs are having to live with, the staffer for one Labour MP described having to act like a bodyguard for an MP and said, we've started having to report tweets that call this MP a fascist and say that they've got blood on their hands. Now, look, you might say accusing someone of having blood on their hands is discourteous, it's heated, it's certainly emotive, but it is not a term of abuse. Come on, it's just not. And I think that what's happening at the moment is that both journalists and politicians have come under an awful lot of criticism for their responses to the genocidal acts taking place in Gaza. And they've interpreted that criticism as abuse, which is why I think you've got such histrionics going on in the media. Now, I'm not talking about actual abuse, as I said. I'm talking about what is perfectly legitimate free expression being wrongly cast as abuse. And then you've got the Islamophobic element of it. There has been, I think, in this country, a willingness to cast British Muslims who are exercising their democratic rights, to put them under the lens of suspicion. So when you had high voter turnout in Tower Hamlets or in Peterborough, you had right-wing newspapers completely falsely and without any evidence alleging that there'd been mass electoral fraud committed by Muslims. Now, there wasn't any evidence of that happening. They just decided that because Muslims turned out to vote for their preferred candidate, that there was some kind of wrongdoing. So similarly, when you see a, pretty, high representation of Muslims as part of the pro-Palestine movement, that gets cast as Islamism, that gets cast as extremism, that gets cast as, a kind of looming sectarian conflict between British Jewish people who are always presented as being, kind of inherently threatened by Muslims, and British Muslims. And it is just Islamophobia, plain and simple. You know, it's the way in which Julia Hartley Brewer earlier in the segment was, speaking of this Islamist threat that had been imported, while there was B-roll, footage being screened of a peaceful pro-Palestine protest. Now, that's a deliberate effort to conflate Islamism and violent extremism with a peaceful and legitimate protest. And it can only be done because people in the media don't think that Islamophobia is much of a problem. In fact, they hold many Islamic views themselves. And because it's chiming with a much longer running moral panic about the presence of British Muslims in this country.